chat. I'm going to cover some of the things that, same things that Ryan did, but from a different perspective and from sort of a, I spent most of my career inside the biopharmaceutical industry working in clinical trials. So I'll come from there. Next slide, please. So this is what everybody knows now. You know, we need to move clinical research out into the community. We have to support what we're doing. You've heard this theme already here. Next slide. And this is clearly why we're all here. You know, the pandemic has forced us to look at new ways of doing things, and we want to know how can we make that stick in our industry. Next slide. And this is very common, and you've heard this before, and Ryan addressed some of it. But the EHR clearly is one of our roads into clinical research. It's healthcare data. How do we repurpose that? And the end part of this quote, you know, we have a chance to make the EHR, making research data collection a byproduct of routine clinical record keeping. But here's a question. When was this quote published? Next slide, please. This quote was published in 1998. So we've understood the problem for many, many years. We do need technology, but next slide. In 1998, what was going on? So we understood the EHR as a possible solution back then. Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin were leading things. Janet Jackson and Titanic were topping the charts. We had just started the commercial internet. Next slide. And that was your phone in 1998. So if you think about the progress your phone has made since 1998, and you think about the progress we've made in using healthcare data for clinical research, it's pretty dramatically different. Next slide. If it were just a technology problem, we'd have solved it by now. And that's the issue. There are other factors involved here, and they're not as sexy and fascinating to us as the technology. We often get fixated on that. But what I want to talk about is sort of 3 pillars as a possible solution at an industry level on how we make this innovation stick, how we improve clinical trials, and do that through healthcare. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about 3 steps. The first is scaling to locate patients. And that's simply because in today's clinical research arena, with the complexity of both regulations and the clinical trials and the types of drugs that we're trying to bring to market, the much more complex clinical conditions, we need a lot of patients to look at in order to find the ones that we need for the studies. Step 2 is bridging the gap from data to humans, because while data has exploded in clinical trials, it's been very difficult for humans to keep up and the institutions to keep up, and their ability to perform research in healthcare as well. And step 3 is changing the factory floor. And that's simply an allusion to the idea of what it takes for us as clinical trial professionals to make this sort of thing happen. Next slide. So step 1 is scaling to locate the patients. With our traditional method, you know, every practice, every site is their own fisherman. They set out their pole and they wait for the fish to come by. And what you get is you get focus on activating sites first, and then the sites recruit, and then eventually patients come in or not. And that's extended over a long period of time. So enrollment really means this whole process of activating sites and looking for patients. So we need to squish that part down. The bottom part there, we need to find a way to effectively locate and enroll those patients. Next slide. So what we need to do is, if you're looking at the red at the bottom, we basically need to locate, identify all the patients at once, and then enroll them all at once. And that will really get at some of the core issues that we have in clinical trials and the time to enrollment and the fact that we never meet enrollment. So how do we do that? Clearly we scale. We work with partners like Cerner, as you heard from Ryan. But one of the issues that we confront in today's world is there's been a data land grab, obviously. And so no one vendor or organization has all of the patients needed for all of the clinical trials. And I mean, you know, across the board, when you're talking about phase 3 clinical trials or rare diseases or post-marketing, all these different diagnostic trials, nobody has all the patients to find all the data to find all the patients at once. And so we have to partner for that scale. And this is a key point that I want to make to the group, is that partnering to scale puts a lot of new things up front that we used to do on the back end. Next slide. Step 2 is bridging the gap from the data to the humans. As I said, we've got a lot of data now to look at, but our real goal is to place humans into actual clinical trials. And so just capturing the data isn't enough. Converting the sites, yes, but there's a whole host of things that need to be done here in order to provide the sort of research infrastructure that we need for research naive investigators, as well as provide a partnering infrastructure where we can use the data from data partners with research naive sites in order to make the final step happen, which is getting the humans into the clinical trials. Next step, next slide, sorry. So this is what we've encountered in Elligo and you've heard this with other speakers. When a site isn't a academic medical research institution, they don't have the time to do research. They don't have the expertise for handling the data necessarily or regulations. And they don't have data access, meaning they access their data for healthcare, but they're not accessing their data to find the patients necessarily unless they've got the canned search inside of their EHR. They don't do sophisticated searches on it. So what we have started to put together at Elligo with our partners' help at Cerner and Kantar is we look at a partnership first in order to scale to find that data. But when we're talking about our own network and introducing investigators to this, we have to define data access and data use up front. If you think about it, for those of you typically in clinical trials in the past, we get the sites, we get the investigators, and all this stuff about data comes later. And in my experience, it often never is successful because of that. Asking informatics questions about the data is key here. And I'm constantly in my role trying to push that up to the front of our discussion. So it's right up front, for example, in Elligo's contract discussions and in our presentation to sites, we're finding out immediately what investigators need to understand. And for our data partners, we're understanding how their data is used, what are the limitations on it, things like that. And then we're coordinating cycle times across all of these data partners and practices and sponsors coming in with the information. And that's a full-time job really, and that takes global coordination. Next slide. So this is the kind of thing, this isn't data directly, but this is data supported, but this is what you need to do in order to get the physicians that are naive involved in research. We have to help them identify their patients. That's clearly directly related to the data and everything I've been talking about, but give them GCP training, give them, electronic repository for the master files, give them study managers or assistants for their study managers or whomever's doing the research, provide a central PI. These are the sorts of things that are related, and each of them is a slight innovation in a sense, bringing all that together to provide a research infrastructure where physicians can, in a sense, there's a lot of work involved still, but they can plug into this, both their data and their time and their efforts in healthcare and then participating in research. This is what it takes to bring at scale sites into research. Next slide. And this is why we haven't moved it to now, in my opinion. Above the waterline here is what we focus on traditionally with the sites and with the investigators and thinking about in general the patients. And we may think some about the data flow in the clinical protocol and the table of events. But when we try and move this, we've forgotten that there's an entire mass below the waterline in today's world that is this massive coordination effort. So for example, on our studies, we have Elligo sites that are in the Elligo network. We have a large number of sites and a tremendous amount of rich data from Cerner, one of our data partners. There's separate efforts ongoing to interface with the data science groups at Cerner and at Elligo. There's separate efforts ongoing to interface with the site management group at Elligo and at the sites. And there's coordination between those two groups in both places. And there's weekly coordination to do that. And then there's contractual issues that we need to get clear on, and there's data use issues that we need to get clear on. My point here is that all of these things in the new world are things we all need to do all the time, but so far, often we think of them as one-offs for the trial. And in fact, they're on every trial today. Next slide. This is the last point that I'm making here. It's changing the factory floor. And this is really, data is not the issue for us anymore. Data is becoming ubiquitous, and FDA's done the most to make that so with 21st century cures as any of us in the industry. But as data becomes ubiquitous, we finally are starting to experience the kind of changes that you would have seen in all of the other industries that haven't been as highly regulated as us, banking and publishing and music industries, where now we are faced with a question, well, how do we best use the data to get the value out of it? Next slide. My best example that I have is electricity. Next slide. When it first came in, you had steam power generators. That picture of the factory there, giant steam powered machine outside the factory running this huge axis down the middle and all these belts off of it. You bring in electricity, they just replace the steam generator with a giant electric motor. They didn't see any productivity increase. And they didn't figure that out until finally they realized you can have small electric motors. You can destroy that factory setup. You can set up things that are more productive because the electricity allows you to change that factory floor. Next slide. This is the same thing that happens over and over again. In the 1980s, we experienced that with the influx of technology and computers and personal computers, and people wondered, how come we don't see productivity there? Productivity only happens after you change the manufacturing floor, whether that's literally with electricity or metaphorically with what's going on in the 1980s or today with what we're doing with clinical trials. Next slide. So how are we supposed to do that? My point here is that our factory floor needs to change because data should now become the first discussions you're having. And this is the way we're trying to approach things. If you've got data partners, you have to understand, as I said, both HIPAA and FDA and global regulations around it. You have to understand the implications of how that data is used, stored, what's there, the informatics of that data. So you need data experts talking to data experts, but also folks that understand clinical trials, understand why you're doing it. And like I said, your ultimate goal is to place patients into trials. So amassing data, figuring it out, modeling it is not enough. You should be thinking with your end in mind as you're doing that, but you should be talking about that data up front. So you need a new process because you're going to move data across partners, also across practices, over to patients, over to investigators. And a bitter pill perhaps to swallow is the verticals that we've had in order to concentrate on site selection or patient engagement and things. Those can theoretically now be flattened because we have the data to flow across and make it more efficient. But there's a lot of inertia there. That's literally what we need to do to change our factory floor. And that's a hard lesson, but we've seen it already that in doing that, if you can get it through, you do get productivity improvement. And you need a central coordination now, whereas before the biopharmaceutical sponsor would do all that. Today, with this flatter organization and many folks involved, you need a central platform organization, and the biopharmaceutical sponsor is participating in that clearly, but they're not coordinating everything anymore. If we do this, freeing up that patient flow, that's where you have advantages. Next slide. And so I'm not going to belabor these. These are natural conclusions, and you guys already have come to these. If you buy into my other thesis, we clearly, feasibility is not a thumb in the air anymore. This is how many patients we've got. It's not how many do you think you have. It's not a heuristic on how you're going to do. It's an actual count of actual patients before you ever start the trial. Next slide. If you're scaling to the degree that we're talking about here, Cerner is a great example. You're already naturally reflective of the demographics you're looking at. So in the United States, at least, when we search through Cerner data, it's already matching demographics of the US to a large extent. And so that solves a problem in terms of having scale to match demography, but at the same time, you're able to focus in on those groups and try and activate those sites in certain areas because you've identified them early. Next slide. And this is key. This was also mentioned before, but if our final goal is really enrolling the humans into trials, the humans very often are going to trust their physician, especially in the research naive sites. So providing that infrastructure to the physicians, working out those processes, engaging their patients for them and providing those services, that's key in closing the final gap in making this happen. Next slide. In the end, what this allows us to do is this frees up now our ability to look at these different designs, come up with hybrid models, DCT, whatever that means to everyone, real world designs that use real world data, healthcare data, also collect data in clinical trials at the same time. These sort of changes are what allow us to get to that endpoint. Next slide. So what I'm saying is that, yes, we absolutely, the data's there, we need the technology, but if we're really going to do this to change clinical trials themselves, regulated clinical trials, we have to first scale to find the patients, because that's where a lot of the inefficiency is and a lot of the slowdown and our failures to ever enroll. We have to bridge the gap from data to humans, and this is highly complex. This is a lot of stuff below the waterline that requires providing infrastructure to sites that haven't had it before, understanding their needs in healthcare, understanding the sponsor's needs for the trial, understanding what the data partner has, the restrictions on how it can be used and how you can transform that data and turn it into patients into trials. And the last step is on us as clinical trial professionals. We have to change the factory floor. It's very much like John Maynard Keynes said about economics. The problem is not so much the new ideas as disabusing yourself of the old ideas. And we tend to cling to these ideas and try and apply technology to solve it. We really have to concentrate in a few areas like patient engagement and how we monitor the trials, and apply data to that so it can flow through faster. And that's how we're going to get the actual innovation to stick. A lot of things to do, but if we do it, we clearly will have better value. We'll be disseminating these results back into healthcare much more quickly, which is exactly what we want to do. And we're going to bring more value to our patients. That's my last slide, I think. Thank you.